Berserkers, axe-wielding, shield-splitting warriors rampaging through towns and cities throughout Northern Europe, conquering and pillaging and being good sailors and boat builders. For 300 years, the Vikings were a force to be reckoned with. So, here are some of the most feared Viking warriors in history. Knute the Great. The most prolific Viking warrior and conqueror of all time was likely Knute the Great. I mean, at the height of his powers, he was the king of 3 countries. Actually, like 3 and a half. His official title was King of England, King of Norway, King of Denmark, and King of part of Sweden. He was able to unite swaths of Scandinavia and Northern Europe into what's been called the North Sea Empire, and he used a terrifying combination of brains and brawn to do it. Knute stormed into England in 1015 with an army of 10,000 men and 200 ships. It was a coalition of Viking mercenaries from all over Scandinavia. Knute had experience fighting in England already. He joined his father, Sweyn Forkbeard, as he conquered the Isle a few years earlier, becoming the first Viking king of England. But Forkbeard died suddenly soon after, and English King Ethelred forced Knute and his men back to Denmark. Knute wasn't happy. I mean, would you be? And he let Ethelred know it by stopping in the coastal town of Sandwich on their way back up to Denmark and removing the heads, ears, and noses of quite a few hostages they'd taken with them, which they left on the beach to let the English know they'd be back. And Knute came back with a vengeance. Ethelred's son, Edmund Ironside, was the one leading the English resistance against the Vikings, and it didn't go well for the Englishmen. In just a few months, the Vikings had besieged London. A deathly ill Ethelred was trapped inside, and he'd pass away during the siege. The Vikings built dikes and dug canals all around London, which allowed their longboats to patrol the perimeter of the city and block the flow of supplies and information along the River Thames, London's lifeline for trade and communication. By controlling the river, the Vikings were able to restrict the movement of ships carrying provisions to and from London. Edmund Ironside and the rest of the Londoners were starving with nowhere to go. It's said that during the final battle, the Bishop of Dorchester was saying Mass in front of Edmund's men when the Vikings stormed through, chopping his body to pieces. This bloody symbol of war would be Knute's welcome to the throne of England. He signed a treaty with Edmund. Knute would control all of Europe except Wessex, which Edmund would control. Upon the death of either Edmund or Knute, the other would become king of all of England. Edmund was wounded during one of the last battles, though, and would die just a few weeks later. Knute was the king of England. More wrath was to follow. Knute went about purging his new kingdom, eliminating any threat to his throne. He took out a slew of English noblemen, including Ethelred's other son, Edwig. The rest of Ethelred's family fled to Normandy, where the late king's wife Emma had protection. But the funny thing is that Knute would end up marrying Emma of Normandy, and despite his brutal past, he actually ended up being a pretty good king. He was religiously tolerant and struck a good balance between English culture and Viking culture. He supposedly converted to Christianity and even got to meet the Pope. Eric Bloodaxe. A guy with a nickname Bloodaxe is most likely someone you don't want to mess with. And Eric Bloodaxe was most definitely a scary Viking. He served a stint as the King of Norway, then ended up in England as the King of Northumbria between 947 and 954. Oh, yeah, and he probably killed 4 of his brothers. According to the Norse saga Fagiskina, Eric's father, who was the King of Norway, Harold Fairhair, gave his son 5 ships when Eric was just 12. He proceeded to terrorize the Danish coast for a few years before moving south along the Scottish coast and the Irish Sea for a few more years. His axe? Well, it got quite bloody from all the raiding. That's how he got his surname. But there's another story about how Eric got his nickname, and it's even more gruesome, at least according to the Agrip saga. Eric's dad, Harold, had a lot of sons. He'd united the Kingdom of Norway and given kingships to 5 or 6 of them, Eric included. But when Harold died, things turned bad very quickly. In a bid to take all of Norway for himself, Eric murdered 4 of his brothers, rampaged through Norway, and took their lands by force. He nearly succeeded, but he missed a half-brother named Håkon. The remaining Norwegian lords were so unhappy with the ruthlessness of Eric's reign that they teamed up, defeated Eric, and installed Håkon as king. Eric, with the blood of 4 brothers on his axe, fled to England, where he would cozy up with King Ethelred and become the ruler of Northumbria. Egil Skallagrimsson. Egil Skallagrimsson allegedly wrote his first poem when he was 3 and took his first life when he was 7. He was a bloodthirsty berserker and an accomplished poet. Imagine that. He also dabbled in a bit of sorcery. And as far as Vikings go, Egil was basically a polymath. He challenged a bunch of people to Viking duels called holmgangs in the following years, and in one particular face-off, he finished his opponent by nearly biting off his head. Egil had a fierce rivalry going with Harald Fairhair, the king of Norway, and when the aforementioned Eric Bloodaxe came to power, things got really bloody. According to the saga of Egil Skallagrimsson, things started to escalate when he took out one of the king's close friends, a guy named Bror of Atli, who had apparently insulted Egil somehow, but based on what we know about Egil's short temper, Bror probably just told him that his shoe was untied or something. King Bloodaxe and his wife, Queen Gunhilla, weren't very happy about this, so Gunhilla sought vengeance for the death of Bror. Gunhilla, known for her cunning and desire for revenge, ordered her two brothers, Eyvind the Braggart and Alfr Axman, to assassinate Egil and his brother. It didn't work out so well for the brothers. They couldn't take Egil by surprise, and he was able to fight back in typical berserker style and end both their lives with his axe. With the poet/berserker apparently impervious to death, Eric and Gunhilla declared Egil an outlaw. It was open season on his head. He was no longer under protection of the law and could be pursued and captured by anyone. In response to the outlaw status, a guy named Berg Annander, a follower of Eric Bloodaxe, assembled a group of men to capture Egil. But once again, their attempt to apprehend him ended in failure, and Egil managed to turn the tables and killed Berg Annander. Before escaping from Norway, Egil had one last middle finger for Eric and Gunhilla. He took the life of one of their sons, Rongunvolder, as revenge for all their attempts on his life before sailing off to England, where he would play the berserker in several important battles. He cursed the royal couple. He took a horse's head, which was a powerful symbol of shame and disgrace, and stuck it on something called a knitting pole. According to his saga, Egil set up the pole in the cliff face and left it standing. He faced the horse's eyes on the land and carved runes upon the pole, and said all the formal words of the curse. Bjorn Ironside. If you're wondering why the famous Ragnar Lothbrok of the Vikings series hasn't been mentioned yet, well, you know what? There's a good reason. He may not have ever existed. There's very little evidence that he was anything more than a legend. There is one mention of him in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle around 840 AD, where two Viking raiders named Ragnar and Reginhirus pop up. A lot of historians think that these two were kind of combined into the actual historical Ragnar Lothbrok, but there's still a lot of debate on that. We do know that a few of his sons who historically claimed to be the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok, did exist. Again, it's unclear if these sons were actually his sons, or if they were just associating their names with a legend to gain status. You know, clout chasing. But let's talk about one of the greatest, Bjorn Ironside. Bjorn appears in a few different chronicles, and he was perhaps one of the most well-traveled Vikings in history. According to Frankish sources, the Swedish warrior terrorized France for a few years in the mid-800s, sailing down the Seine, looting Paris twice, and setting up a semi-permanent camp nearby. He then set his sights on the Mediterranean. According to legend, Bjorn led a fleet of Viking longships on daring voyages to raid and plunder cities along the coast of the Mediterranean Sea, including the Iberian Peninsula, North Africa, and Italy. He co-piloted the journey along with his foster father, a Viking named Hastin. One of the most interesting parts of their trip was a bit like the Viking version of the Trojan horse, if the gods on the horse made a mistake and ended up at the gates of the wrong city. The Vikings arrived at a town called Luni, which they thought was Rome because, well, they were Vikings from Scandinavia, and their map game was suspect. They tried their best to breach the town's walls, but were having a pretty tough time. So to gain entry, Hastin and Bjorn channeled their inner Greek and came up with a pretty clever plan. Hastin feigned a near-death illness and asked that he be given access to the local church for Christian sacraments and burial on consecrated ground. The unsuspected clerics led Hastin and a small honor guard into the chapel, but to their surprise, Hastin leaped from his stretcher, and he, Bjorn, and their men proceeded to chop their way through the horrified Italians and open up the gates. But once they were inside Luni, the Vikings realized that it wasn't Rome as they had initially believed. They realized that the real Rome would be a whole lot harder to get into than his comparatively insignificant city. So they changed their minds about the whole Rome thing and set sail back toward Scandinavia. Thorkel the Tall. The Vikings were a group of elite mercenaries who lived during the 10th and 11th centuries. They were the best of the best. They observed a strict code of conduct and were near fanatical followers of the Old Norse gods at a time when Christianity was seeping into Viking culture from all sides. They lived in a mysterious fort called Jomsburg that no one has been able to find, but historians actually think was real. They trained there like Navy SEALs. I mean, who knows? Maybe David Goggins knows about this place. One of the most fearsome of these already most fearsome Jom kings was Thorkel the Tall. Thorkel was a powerful Danish nobleman and a warrior who was a big player in the Viking conquest of England in the early 11th century. He was known for his towering height, obviously, unless he was super short and his friends had a sense of humor. But no, he was a tall, powerful, well-trained fighting machine of a Viking. Thorkel the Tall initially served as a prominent member of the Jomsvikings, where he made a name for himself in the Battle of Jorungavirga. Did I say that right? Man, I sure hope so. Anyway, the battle was a crazy one between the Danish mercenaries of the Jarls of Larda, a group of Norwegian Jarls. It was a naval battle, but one that took place in an intense hailstorm. As if arrows and axes weren't enough to worry about, the warriors apparently had to avoid getting knocked out by a piece of ice the size of a golf ball. In the early 11th century, Thorkel the Tall entered into a complex web of alliances and conflicts involving quite a few Scandinavian rulers. He ended up fighting alongside King Sweyn Forkbeard of Denmark in military campaigns. Thorkel's military prowess and strategic abilities proved instrumental in helping Sweyn plow through England in around 1011 and help capture London in 1013. But then Sweyn died, and his son Knute, the one we discussed earlier, came to power. Thorkel's loyalty wasn't exactly unwavering. He later switched sides and allied with the English king Ethelred the Unready against the Danish forces led by Knute. Thorkel played a crucial role in leading the English armies against the Danes, and his defection significantly weakened Knute's position in England. But not that much. Knute came through victorious, and after Ethelred died of an illness during Knute's siege of London, Thorkel switched back, and he was such a great warrior that Knute apparently brushed off the fact that he'd betrayed him and served as the King of England, Norway, Denmark, as one of his most important and powerful military commanders. What other fearsome Vikings do you want to hear about? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more nutty history.